All right. Today we have Shari Dunn with us, who is an author and a daily journalist in my world who keeps me up to speed with a balanced but concise view of what's happening in the world around us and saves me from spinning over everything to try to get it focused. So, Shari, tell us about the book and tell us about how you got there from where you were.
Yeah, well, I wrote a book. It's called Qualified: How Competency Checking and Race Collide at Work. Here's my little handy dandy visual aid. So, wow. So I wrote this book. I began writing this book 3 years ago now because it was published last year, February 2025. So coming up on the 1 year anniversary date of publication. And so I started 2 years before that. So, in the life of publishing, it's a long kind of process to get there. And yet the book dovetailed with the moment, which was wild, right? The book ended up being exactly on target for where we ended up being at the end of 2025, which was not my intention, but it ended up that way. And I wrote a book over 50. I wrote a book. So it's my first published book with HarperCollins. So that was like a whole journey. And really, it just came from, my own personal lived experience. And then as a consultant, working with Black folks and other people of color in the workplace and just hearing their frustration, sadness, confusion, anger, and wanting to find a way to represent that and to come up with some concrete, what is this? What is happening to people? And then what could we do about it? So that's kind of the like nickel version of the journey of the book.
Well, when I was on TikTok, back before I got off of that too, but when I was on TikTok was about the time that the bear conversation happened. Would you rather be in the
Mm.
woods with a bear or a man? And then it morphed into would you for people of color, would you rather be in a conference room with a white man or a white woman? And they overwhelmingly chose the white men because you
Yeah.
knew what to expect, but white women
Mhm.
less helpful, and the betrayal sense of betrayal was deeper. So
Mhm.
writing the book and understanding hearing the feelings of people in the workplace, did any of that thread pull through? And
Oh yeah.
so tell our audience of white women in the workplace
Yeah.
what we don't know and need to pay attention.
Yeah. Well, there are two chapters in the book specifically that really touch on this, and one is unmasking imposter syndrome, which is really digs into the misidentification of what people are meaning when they talk about imposter syndrome. And then the other chapter I have is for Black girls who've considered quitting when sisterhood would have been enough, which is a play on a play called for Black girls who've considered suicide when rainbows would have been enough. But that's a old play from the I think 70s. But in any event, those two chapters really speak to that. With unmasking imposter syndrome, what I try to get at in that chapter is that imposter syndrome is a misidentification of the impact of competency checking on white women. And competency checking is the ways in which you are required to prove your knowledge and skills and ability at a higher, harder level. And what I point out in the book is that the two white women who came up with this idea of imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, as they first called it in the early 70s, they were doing research. They were therapists, psychotherapists. I think at least one of them was. They had therapy groups of white women. They, as sometimes white women did then and now tend to do, they did not see themselves as part of a collective civil rights struggle. And so when they were identifying the problems the women were having at work, they were reporting these problems as if they were originating from the women. In other words, the women felt insecure. The women felt they had to work harder. The women felt, and I read that and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. The women in their study, it was a 5 year study. I kind of nerd out on this, but it was a small study, under 100 women. And the 5 years went from when women had no ability to open their own checking account to open their checking account. The women in the study were the first vanguard of women in the quote professional workplace outside of being secretaries or assistants, right? And instead of them saying, oh, wait, these are systematic issues that are making these women feel this way, they ended up essentially blaming the women for their feelings. Does that make sense? And then they talked about this need for perfection, but at no point do they talk about the patriarchal archetype of white womanhood that leaves no room for imperfection, right? So my problem with imposter syndrome is it misidentifies the cause and that then gave us the wrong medicine. So we were told, so women then, white women were told the medicine is self-talk, be more confident, da 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 da. No, the answer was system change, the system. And so this puts white women on a collision course with black women because
Mhm.
black women generally come into situations and they're like, no, I'm not an imposter. I'm fine. I've worked hard. I know what I'm doing. And then a lot of white women read that as, oh, they're so uppity, they're so dominant. It's like, no, I don't what's so we now think we have two different reasons that things are happening, right? One group says, oh, it's because you're an imposter. And quick story, I wasn't even going to include this chapter in the book, but I had a conversation with a white woman who wanted me to do a talk about imposter syndrome. And I explained to her that I thought it was a misidentification. And she just was totally confused. She was kind of upset and she's like, I've never heard anything like that before. And she told me, I talked to experts and they say anybody who won't admit to being an imposter either is a narcissist or a liar. And I was aghast. So now we have a problem, right? Because if black women come into spaces and won't admit to being an imposter, then they're a narcissist or a liar. And when I would talk to black women, they'd be like, I don't believe in imposter syndrome. I just, because it's not being insecure is something every human has. That's totally separate. But calling the reaction, the natural logical reaction to being the only person in the space, to being forced to prove yourself, to being in a hostile environment of insecurity, a syndrome that you have is bananas. It
Mhm.
is a response to where you are. So anyway, so that chapter came about because of this. And actually it's kind of indicative of the two roads that white women and black women kind of walk on because white women will frequently talk about women's rights in a generic sense and not tie it to the civil rights struggle. Whereas black women, yes, we have women's issues, but we cannot unroot ourselves from the racial civil rights struggle, right? So it ends up sending us in slightly different directions, which goes to the other chapter, which really creates a barrier to sisterhood and collective action. And just a quick aside, in the book, I talk about the fact that that study also didn't include lower income white women. And so at the same time this study was going on, Norma Ray, who you might remember from the movie, which was actually a woman named Crystal Lee Sutton, a real woman, who was doing community organizing in the South. I think it was Virginia. I think it was Virginia. But she came to work and thought, sexism, racism, and patriarchy is causing us problems here at work. And she did something that I think it was like 75, 78 in the South that still wasn't done. She got a multiracial coalition of women at her workplace to unionize. It's the famous scene where she's standing up in the
Yeah.
shop. And that is the difference. She said, look, what's causing us problems here at work are systemic problems that are affecting all of us women. And we're going to work together to make a systemic change. So I often make the argument that even if the researchers would have talked to just different types of white women, they would have got a different answer rather than imposter syndrome. And unfortunately, now imposter syndrome has become an industry. And I mean, it's a thing.
We're gonna fix you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's like hysteria. Like women didn't have hysteria either. And they don't have imposter syndrome. They have a natural response to being in a hostile environment or being forced to perform. And so the fix is not internal. It's not to say people can't have internal fixes, but that's not the primary fix. The fix is workplaces need to have better work-life balance. Childcare needs to be discussed as well as familial care. These are real issues that cause people insecurity when they step into spaces.
I don't think we can talk about women in the workplace without talking about the disproportionate number of Black women who are not in the workplace
Right.
this year versus last year.
Hmm.
isn't it odd that it coincided almost exactly with the rise of meritocracy,
Mhm,
as they've tried to dismantle DEI and all things
mhm,
equity.
mhm,
Uh,
mhm.
Tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's part of an intentional effort. And I think it's part of an intentional effort to dislodge Black people in general out of professional workplaces. And it's not like there were so many. I mean, one of the problems is we there's some research I cite in the book where we overestimate the presence of difference.
Mhm.
And it is particularly it's particularly striking in the case of Black people. So they showed a group of white people images of different folks. And then they said, okay, out of these pictures, what percentage do you think is Hispanic or what percentage? And they overestimate people of color. But when it comes to Black people, people vastly overestimate. So let's say you show them 40 pictures and 10 of the pictures are Black. They would say half were Black. Now, why does that matter? Because people had a perception that four Black people rose to some managerial level in a business of 1,000, that all Black people were getting all the jobs. So
Uh-huh.
there's a combination of both hysteria and a psychological thing where people overestimate the presence of Black people that causes this fear. And then there is this myth of meritocracy, which is a myth. The United States has never been a meritocracy. That's just a total lie. And I dig into that in my book because it was really important to talk about that. I go all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt. When he graduated from Harvard, he had D's and C's, and he had D's and C's getting into Harvard. And the reason I show that is because there was no discussion of merit really. It was really about status, income, and familial status in
Mhm.
society. That is how the United States has pretty much always been, as far as who succeeds and who doesn't. And the only time that changed was in the 1900s or so when Jewish folks start applying to and getting accepted to some of these elite schools like Harvard and Yale. And that is when the SAT comes on to being. And the SAT actually comes out of a test called the military intelligence test. And the military intelligence test was a test designed to prove that Nordic white people were smarter than Jews. I'm not even making that up. That's like there's a whole big book about this. And so the point is, merit only matters when an out group wants in, but it doesn't matter for the in group. And we see that. We see that in the Trump administration. We see that literally playing out. So for Black women, they're in a double bind. So Black women tend to the statistic of Black women being the most educated group is a little wonky. What the statistic actually is trying to say is Black women tend to come into spaces heavily educated. So they have a PhD in a job that requires an undergraduate degree. They have a master's degree in a job that requires a high school education. And that's because of underemployment, because Black people tend to be hired for jobs not commensurate. So they tend to be kind of bunched up in spaces, but they have the degrees. But the hostility that Black women face in the workplace is very complex. It is a hostility they get from white men, white women, Black men, other people of color. It is quite the thing to navigate and try to, run through the gauntlet to run. And so Black women are losing their jobs at an alarmingly high rate, at an alarmingly high rate. And over 400,000 Black women have lost their jobs in under 12 months. And now people say, oh, a good portion of that is governmental jobs. It's true. It's true that Black people tend to have found and still found advancement in governmental jobs rather than private industry because private industry does not have a lot of Black people. So this idea that Black people have been unfairly getting these jobs, like not for merit, is just simply untrue. But last hired, first fired, on the way in, all these reasons that last hired, first fired has been used since the end of slavery for Black people. So we're perpetually for 400 years the last hired, first fired. It's like no amount of time makes us not the last hired, first fired. But Black women face a unique bind in the workplace and not a lot of ally support. And to your point earlier, when you ask Black women where they find ally support, it's usually if they identify anybody, it's white men. Now that seems weird, right? Black women don't have a lot of natural allies in the workplace. So when things hit the fan or they need support, they don't really have a lot of support to pull from. And then things like their tone. And Black women tend to be, this is an aside, I'll go back to the other point, but Black and white women are raised and acculturated in this society in two very different ways, as are other women of color. So that's the thing. This society, since its inception, tends to infantilize white women, meaning really prioritize a childlike presentation, this perpetual girlhood, the obsession with youth, that kind of thing. Well, Black women actually aren't raised in that acculturation because from our origin point here in the United States, we were workers. We were not children. We were not girls. We were, cattle, so for several hundred years, we are not even human. We're like animal, cattle things that you use however you want to, do whatever you want. But the attributes of innocence and childhood just were never there. And so even when we come out of that, Black girls are still held accountable. They're, in your home, your family could treat you like a princess, but the world does not. So Black women learn to communicate in a much more direct
Yes.
um, way, not because they necessarily want to, but because society reacts to us differently. So
Mhm.
society doesn't react to white women and Black women in the same way. And you figure that out fairly quickly as a young person. And then so Black women tend to be more definitive. They tend so you come into the workplace with skills that a lot of white women attribute as naturally male because they've not been allowed to have those skills and they're supposed to talk quietly and go under. Whereas Black women are not, because that's not how society. And so I often tell people, and it's called adultification. So the adultification of Black kids happens. So I often tell people when adultification meets infantilization in the workplace, what could go wrong except everything, everything. Because our basic communication models are very different. So consequently, I think that could be one of the reasons. There's a teeny bit of research I cite on this, why Black women tend to have more allyship with white men in the workplace. Now, that doesn't mean that that's because white men are so enlightened and they're so great. It means that white men have more authority and power. And because they have more authority and power, they tend to be less worried about extending that because they're not going to lose anything.
Right.
But white women tend to be more challenged by Black women in the workplace as some kind of personal challenge, as opposed, and white women have less power. So people who have less power are more worried about extending their credibility because if they lose power, they really lose power.
Right.
So the reason I think that white men tend to emerge frequently in stories with Black men or Black women as more supportive is because they have less to lose. It's their game. You know what I mean? And so if they extend a little few crumbs to you, what's it matter? Right? So and they tend to be less challenged by the way Black women present. Aside, they do not, however, do like when white women present that way, right? So while they will be less challenged with a more definitive type of Black woman, because that's how society sees this, period. When white women try to adopt that in their interactions with white men, it doesn't go the same. And when Black men try to adopt that, it doesn't go the same. So white men tend to be more challenged by Black men being dominant and authoritative and white women being dominant and authoritative than they are by Black women being dominant and authoritative. Does that make sense? It's kind of like
Tells you,
crazy.
doesn't it?
Huh?
Tells you the pecking order in the
Yes, it's like crazy psychology. And so it still all comes back to race and gender-based dominance. So
does.
I just want to be super clear. I'm not saying like white men are secret allies. I mean, some are. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that it really is rooted in patriarchal racial hierarchy, if that makes sense.
I want to move women from ally to advocate to accomplice.
Mhm.
That's the trajectory in my mind of how do we get white women to A, recognize their privilege, because there is that competitive edge
Mhm.
where oh, and I saw it during the last election cycle, and that was when it
Mhm.
really peaked for me when the numbers of white women who did not go the way they said they were going to go when it
Mhm.
came to shove, and the black community saying, don't, we're not showing up at
Mhm. Mhm.
protests or whatever. We're not doing it. You need to figure this out. Best thing they ever did, because we had to
Mhm.
figure out, still do. But that allyship, what is it about white women? This is a question to me and the universe as much as
Mhm.
what is about white women that makes us think if we do blue bracelets after a horrific loss, that makes us the one of the good ones?
Mhm.
What
Yeah,
what is this performative stuff that
yeah.
we do rather than lean in and lock arms and
Well, there's a couple things. So first, I want to give white women some credit to start. I mean, there are a lot of white women who have really put themselves on the line. I think about the woman, I can't recall her name right now, but in the civil rights movement who went throughout the South and was murdered, a white housewife who lost her life. And I often think when people talk about statues, we could do statues to, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. And there are plenty of white people and white women who have, in fact, done the ultimate sacrifice around civil rights and the rights of women and really pushing themselves. But I think collectively, white supremacy is very seductive. And it is historical. It's kind of built into our thinking. And to think of it like this, there are Black people who choose white supremacy. Tim Scott and Clarence Thomas. There are Hispanic Latinx people who some are white because it's not a racist ethnicity, but ethnic prejudice against them is significant, and they still choose white supremacy. So to be fair, white supremacy is apparently very seductive, even to non-white people, because people want access to power and adjacency, or what they think is power and adjacency. And that is a key. And I think for white women, it is a selective memory around this. So, in other words, there is this perception that white women benefit from white supremacy, which to a certain extent they do, to a certain extent. But to a certain extent, they also lose, right? And that's always been the case. And they lose in fundamental ways, right? So initially in the United States, white women were imported like cattle to have babies here because there wasn't enough white babies. And they literally were sold and traded into the United States to have children. And then even here, white women had no ability to own a thing except slaves. They could own slaves. But they, and what that meant was you could be sexually abused, physically abused, and mentally abused. And it was routine. But white women don't tell that story to each other. Rather, when they think of white supremacy, it's only this kind of clean version of what white supremacy will offer, not what white supremacy takes away from white women. So for a lot of people, I think when it comes down to voting, they go in the booth, they're like, I better pick white supremacy. And it may not be like that conscious, right? It's not, for most people, it's not that conscious, but there's this unconscious feeling that there's something they're going to get, and there isn't enough discussion. There isn't enough illumination about what white supremacy has cost white women. So a lot of white women really don't know. Like I think of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is just now realizing patriarchy exists. It's bananas, but she can't call it. She won't call it patriarchy. But I mean, early on, she was like, the men are excluding the Republican women from meetings. Girl, that's how it's done. But it's not something she can intellectually quite get to. And that I think is a problem. And so I think for white people and for white women in particular, if you think you are outside of it, then maybe you think doing bracelets is I'm supporting. No,
yeah,
you're in it. You
yeah.
need to fight it just like I'm fighting it because it is actually harming you too. So when you think of yourself as outside of it, and I'm an ally and I'm not impacted, so I'm going to do bracelets or hats or whatever, No, no, no. You need to fight like your life depends on it. That's a different type of mentality. So I think shifting that mentality is why the performative things happen, as opposed to understanding, oh, no, no, no. This is like, and we hear that now, right? We have some things that are happening that people aren't paying attention to. The EEOC, under a woman, a white woman, has expressed hostility to workplace protections around pregnancy. And the reason is they literally want to force women, and that includes white women, out of their jobs. So while Black women may be the tip of the spear in feeling the impact, it is coming for all women. But so the more that white women think they stand outside of it, the less they are to act with real passion and real commitment because they don't think it, is relevant to them. They also are reviewing the Fair Credit Act to that would perhaps layer in requirements, some of the requirements that were gotten rid of in the 70s around your ability to get credit individually. They are literally trying to hem white women back up into a way that they cannot function as well in a society without men, as a way to force them to get married, to have children. So when I say this is not just, a race-based fight, it isn't. And getting white women to understand that there is a fire alarm that impacts you is part of the difficulty.
And there's so much denial, the denial, the diminishing, the minimizing that our white culture does with white women.
Mhm.
Don't notice, and if you do, don't look, and if you do look, don't say anything.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I think the way in which society encourages white women to ignore things is
Right.
actually a bigger societal issue for whiteness in the United States and maybe around the world, but I can only really talk about the United States. And part of it has to do with our Protestant religious culture, and then a lot of it has to do with slavery and colonization. So you can't live in a society where you are enslaving children, women, adult men, and you are raping the women. I mean, because the thing of it is, slavery was a system of sexual exploitation as much as it was a system of physical exploitation, unless you divide your mind,
Yes.
unless you divide it, right? You have to pretend you don't see all these mixed children on the plantation and they're your husband's kid. You have to engage. You can't dispossess indigenous people out of their lands and pretend you didn't unless you do a dual consciousness. So part of white identity really does require a dual consciousness, right? And a minimization. You have to minimize, or else it would be kind of horrific to really look at what it is, right? And so that is something that I think, and I talk about that a bit in the book, that it's a cultural thing. I think white women teach their daughters, granddaughters, daughters. It's very taught. Black people, we live in just a very different world. Like we have to look at all the ugly because we have to live in the ugly. We've always had to live in the, so we had to look at it straight. So we tend to call it differently. We call it like, no, and white women, and to bring empathy to this, this is a culturally enforced norm, right? So it's not like some individual person is doing it, but it's a problem. And it ends up being a problem in the home. It ends up being a problem around sexual abuse, violence, and other things because there's this priority paid on presentation and appearance and hiding and minimizing. So it's just two different, again, just two really different ways of, I just don't think we talk enough about the fact that how differently that we are acculturated and how differently society reacts to us. And those societal reactions are going to shape how you interface with the world, right? And I wish we talked about it more across each other because I think it would help us understand each other a little bit better.
And how the minimization of it, well, it's not white supremacy except for KKK. So if it doesn't have
Right.
a KKK label, then it's really not that. It's something else. You just don't know.
Mhm.
Or, oh no, I'm not racist.
Right.
Okay? Racism, that is a triggering word for a lot of white folk, is don't call me a racist because I don't wear the white hat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Well, that's cultural, right? Because once again, you really had to minimize what was going on in this country for several hundred years. You had to pretend that it was okay to take little children and sell them. I mean, that takes a lot of thought, right? And so you have to say, well, it's not that bad. It's not, I'm not doing that. And then also, I think white people tend to personalize. This is actually a very big difference, and I talk about this in the book. It's a difference between white and black people. White people generally, I think, tend to personalize
Mhm.
being white as an individual attribute. It's like if you say something about white people, you are literally talking about them and their family every day.
And they are
Which is really weird because the terms white and black are only about 400 years old, and they really come about as a power dynamic to establish this group and this group. So they're not really very old terms, but white people are very tied to whiteness as a personal identifier. Whereas I think, again, black people, we know we were given the name black,
Mhm.
right? We know that's not who we are. Like we were brought here and then they gave us color and then they said we were black. Like we are totally clear that the identifiers are not us. I am black because that's what people told me, but I also know it's an identifier somebody gave me. White people seem so much more wed to the idea of being white, so that when you do talk about racism, they do take it like literally personally and aren't aware that there's this bigger structure of white supremacy that they are in, right? That they are in that structure. I'm not saying, Karen personally or Martha personally or John personally. I'm saying there's this bigger structure, and that is something that a lot of white people don't know. So when you say races are race, they freak out because they think you're only talking about them personally. And most white people today who are identified as white were not identified as white when white first started, because that was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So most other people, Italians, Irish, Jewish folks, they only get added to whiteness later, much later on by other white people. And so what I always tell people is that white, and James Baldwin talks about this, whiteness cut off white people from their other actual identities, their identities as ethnics, their identity culture, their identity. They have white people we identify as white have bigger, richer cultures than whiteness. But they don't know that because it's like whiteness is fused. It's just interesting because as a black person, I'm black. I like being black. I understand black culture, but I also know black is a name that was given to us. It's not historical, you know.
I had a podcast guest on the end of last year who was a genealogist and challenged me to follow my maternal lines up through. And I've never done genealogy, but
Mhm,
I started a little series called Deconstructing Whiteness where I did that out
mhm,
loud. And I'm now it's like a board game. I'm back to the 1100s.
mhm.
I didn't even know they kept records back that far.
They do. Yeah.
But so it's been pretty interesting. But the idea was that I had no, I would meet with creators and I would interview people and they knew who they were, which is
Right.
a different grounding in your body, in your
Mhm,
community, and in the way you move in the world that I admire and envy. And Black women in workspaces, my experience is that they carry way more degrees than they
mhm,
ever need to. I looked at
mhm,
yours before this and I'm like, oh,
mhm,
I can't get in a room without feeling inferior because I
mhm,
was a late in life student. But that speaks to the privilege, right? That right there. If nothing else did, it would be of those 400,000, Black women who are not working this year, who were last year. I don't care where they are. Wherever they were overqualified, very likely, for the role
mhm.
they held. And it's
Well, and
unfair.
when they are the front lines, but you're next. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
yes, they are the front line of losing this battle, but you're up next. I mean, it's not that whiteness is going to protect white women from white patriarchy. It's
Oh,
not.
oh,
So there is that, and I think that like go back to Marjorie Taylor Greene, I don't think she's had some liberal awakening, but it has occurred to her that doesn't actually work out the same, right? And it had not occurred. And I think, white privilege for me, I actually like the word, I actually think about whiteness as more as an opportunity advantage than privilege. Like if I had a say in early language development as how I would not probably have used the word privilege, mainly because privilege is a triggering word because it implies something that culturally we understand through wealth. And most people say, well, I don't have wealth, so I don't have privilege. So it gets complicated. But I think of it more as opportunity advantage, which is what white people have. And that opportunity advantage is easier for people to understand, to see. And I think that but the opportunity advantage is hidden. It's hidden in systems. So it's easy to assume if you're in a workplace and it's 100 people and only three are Black, oh, most Black people aren't qualified. It's easy to assume because the opportunity advantages that got you there are hidden. And so you don't know they exist. You don't know the barriers, the competency checking barriers that the Black folks have endured. So consequently, it's easy to assume. So you look around your neighborhood and you say, oh, there aren't a lot of Black people here because they don't know how to save money and buy homes. You don't think about, redlining. You don't understand after World War II, functionally, no Black men really received the GI housing loan, whereas millions of white men did. And that actually created the white middle class because that initial home boom after the World War II is the basis of most white people's wealth. And I don't mean wealthy wealth, I mean just basic wealth, the ability to buy another house, send your kids to school kind of wealth came out of that came out of that. If you don't know that an entire group, 1 million Black men, I mean, the number of Black men who got the housing loan was in maybe 1,000, maybe United States wide. And then where could they use it? They couldn't move to the new suburbs. They were racially discriminated. They couldn't move. So if you don't know that, it is very easy to look around and make incorrect assumptions like, oh, it's just they don't know how to save. They're lazy or they whatever. It's just so easy to shorthand it because the opportunity advantages have been hidden. So anyway, I kind of when I talk about it, I think more of that than privilege because privilege is this word that has such a definitive meaning to us all, and it can be a stumbling point, I think, for people, but it's a quibble.
So in this year, as the deconstruction of DEI and the dirty wordingness of it, DEI is on every level. And I work with a lot of people who have served and burned out in that arena even before this.
Hmm.
Originally, we started this podcast to reclaim joy in DEI. And then in this last year, I have watched very accomplished, successful people who've lost contracts, who've lost positions, lost traction, who've they've tried to bend the knee. There's no other way to say that. They've tried
Hmm.
to modify their verbiage to maintain their livelihood.
Livelihood, yeah.
That's not working out so well either.
Nope. There's
Uh,
no way around it.
yeah. So tell me, what do you see, and where do people who care about racial equity and about advancement and about opportunity and opportunity costs, particularly in the blacking and browning of America as we're headed in
Mhm.
20 years.
Well, I don't know if we're headed there, right? I mean, they're actively
Get
looking to
rid of
change, yeah, immigration policy to prioritize white immigration so that doesn't happen. So
uh
that saying that has caused a lot of angst that has caused a backlash to try to divert that. So that may not be true. Um, but I think diversity, equity, inclusion. First of all, I always tell people these words have plain language definitions. So diversity is a word, and we don't live and exist without diversity, right? Biodiversity, genomic diversity, our genes. The planet's dead without biodiversity. So diversity is a fundamental core of human existence. Um, Equity is, as a former attorney, is part of our actual foundational legal system. The reason we have a public defenders is because we need equitable representation in front of the law. Inclusion is a natural extension of e pluribus unum. How do you get to many out of one is through inclusiveness of all, right? So I always like to back people up on the actual plain language definition of the words. As a modality, DEI was never going to be able to do everything everybody wanted it to do. First of all, DEI is not affirmative action, so it did not have a legal basis. It is not the EEOC, so it doesn't have a compliance basis. It is it is a way to take those things, affirmative action, EEOC, and make them some sort of practical practice in the workplace. But the pressure that DEI was under, which was to transform everything immediately after the death of George Floyd in a year to two, was ridiculous. I mean, it was just like, first of all, there's no precedent for that. And how could this modality do that? So there's that. Then, I always tell people there are bad practitioners of every type. I used to work in television news, and we would have news consultants, and they were terrible. Some of them were just idiots. I don't know who these people were. And they would come and they would tell us the stupidest things. And I mean, it was just a foolishness. But sometimes these people would, I mean, a lot of times they would have a input over who got to be a news anchor and who got to be a reporter. And they brought their own prejudices, their own lack of knowledge, their own lack of skill. No one looks at other consultancies and says, "Oh, you did a bad job. We're going to outlaw your consultancy." So I always like to leave room for the fact that, sure, there's some not great DEI practitioners, people who were doing psychotherapy in the workplace, which I don't, as a person with a legal background, plus other backgrounds, is not the way I have ever approached my work. And I don't think it's a good way to approach the work. But that being said, there are terrible management consultants. They're terrible, so DEI was put under this microscope and pressure that was unrealistic from the start. That somehow you were going to do what 400 years couldn't do in the United States in 2 years. That's nuts, so that was nuts from the start. To your point, people who've tried to change the language on their websites or they don't care. They've said point blank, they're going to come after anything that is a whiff of fairness, inclusiveness, and diversity. So it doesn't matter. These people are very, very serious about a rollback to a time where there is one dominant player, and that is white men. And that's it. That's it. They don't care what you do or don't say, anything that you do or allude to, and that's why I think blaming DEI is a sucker's bet. There are people out here saying, "Oh, we should talk about fairness. We should talk about merit." Well, again, merit is something that only matters for out group, not in group. Fairness, what is fairness? How do you talk about fairness on unlevel ground? Like, that's ridiculous. And so I don't think you're going to hide your ultimate aims by not saying DEI. Like, I just think that's a fool's errand. But what can people do? I think there are practical systemic things. One of the things I talk about in the book is referral-based hiring. So if somebody's in a workplace and they say, "What can I do to look at the fairness and who we get in our pipeline?" The pipeline of Black folks is not empty, it is blocked. And the things that are blocking it are things that we can remove. And one of the things we can remove is referral-based hiring. Why, you ask? Well, referral-based hiring is a vestige of that time I talked about before, where you were hired because of your status or who your family knew. And, George Thomas Jefferson writes a letter, "Please consider hiring this person as an apprentice." That's referral-based hiring. It's just morphed into its modern form. And what the data tells us, it is 90+% white.
Yeah.
So it does not favor other people, and it overwhelmingly favors men. And A lot of people say, oh, well, you just get more Black people in power and they can refer people. Does not work that way. Data shows that Black referrals do not go as far, are not taken as seriously, are not, they just, it doesn't, it's a system designed for who it works for. So if you want to have, and conversely, what happens is Black folks and women and other people of color come in what I call the front door, a more formal front door. So they have to get past AI bots screening. They have to go through 20 panel interviews on what people are doing nowadays, just crazy stuff. And the narrowing is so tiny that by the time you get there, it does seem like there's a trickle in the pipeline because you have artificially put all these wire meshes in the pipeline on the front door. The back door is way more relaxed, looser. You can get more people in. So if you want to really be fair, you will stop referral-based hiring, which would be my preference. But I know people, maybe they're never going to stop, but maybe they could reduce it. So some industries do 30 to 50% of referral-based hiring is how they get hired. So maybe bring that down to 10% and then look on the front door and see how can I open this aperture better? How can I get a better flow of people through the front door, right? That that has nothing, you're not even saying the words diversity, equity, or inclusion. There's not, but you could create a better flow and a more fairer flow of access to employment by reducing referral-based employment because referral-based employment also replicates the existing space. So if it's predominantly men, it's always going to be predominantly men. If it's predominantly white people, it's all because that's who you're referring, not because they're necessarily racist. It's housing discrimination, right? Who you live near, who you know, that's who you're going to refer. So if you don't want that, you're going to have to stop that and you're going to have to go to the front door better. It's not enough to say, well, we'll just bring more. It just doesn't work that way. The referral-based pipeline just does not work as well for non-white people as it does for white people. There you go. That's a practical solution.
The companies that jumped on the DEI bandwagon after George Floyd and put in their folks and their programs to prove we're one of the good ones are the
Mhm.
first ones. You want to talk last in, first out. They were the
Mhm.
first ones out when this administration said, "Oh, you don't have to do that anymore."
Mhm.
How fast can we get rid of it? And my frustration with DEI had always been that it was a check the box proposition,
Mhm.
underfunded, under authorized, and still had to answer to the front office or the top of the food chain
Mhm.
for actual results. And people burning out rapidly.
Quickly, yeah. But I said I always want to separate. I don't think it's DEI's fault. I think that's a
Oh,
management emphasis, a management fault. And I
mhm.
think that what I always try to remind people is that every international corporation does diversity, equity, inclusion. They cannot run otherwise, right? So every international corporation has to examine who do we have employed to interface with people in our China office, our Indian office. Every corporation that operates internationally has to understand cultural things. We can't work on this Tuesday because of this, and we can't have this kind of food product. They have to do that to run their business. So businesses actually do know how to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a business perspective. But the problem was I think part of the problem was we were positioning internal US-based DEI as a moral perspective. And I think that is a difficult thing. It's incredibly difficult to get a human being to change their moral outlook. It's very, it may be a fool's errand. I'm not 100% sure you can do it with a grown-up human being. Like some people change, but most people don't. But what we could have done better is position this more as and I know a lot of people do not like this discussion, but I think it's just the way it's got to be, a business imperative. And I think the people who did that had a better go at it. The people who approach DEI from a business imperative perspective, I have a diverse population I want to reach. I want to increase my access to them. I want to expand my product offerings. They did better and they put more resources into it but people who were pushing it from a moral imperatives don't actually fit that well in corporate spaces. And so ghettoized it into HR, or they ghettoized it into some other area. They didn't elevate it because they didn't know where it went, because it doesn't really, moral imperatives don't really fit like that. So I think part of it was a misidentification of where the imperative should have been placed, in addition to your point, an underfunding. And the fact that businesses and corporations can see DEI, because it wasn't called that, but they could function internationally. But when it came internally, they couldn't make that same connection. Well, that's a business problem too, and it's also a problem of imagination and fundamentally a lack of understanding of how race really works in the United States. I mean, corporate heads don't know any better than anybody else. So anyway, I think businesses actually are better at DEI than we think. They just don't call it DEI when they're doing international work. I think that part of the problem was people were trying to change individuals' moral perspective in the workplace. Yeah, so I think that's the distinction. I think that was a big part of the problem. If you go into a workplace, have people talk about their first experience with racism, and, you're
Mhm.
going to try to change it's almost like I always tell people, you don't remember, I don't, maybe some people do. I don't remember learning my ABCs. I mean, I
Yeah.
know my ABCs. I know how the letters go together, but I literally have no memory of that.
Mhm.
You're not going to, in a workplace setting, train me to unremember my ABCs. Like that's not thing. And I'm gonna freak out if you try to get me to unremember my ABCs. And to a certain extent, race, gender, how we think about these things are like that.
Mhm.
And if the goal of the training or the work comes off like you're trying to get me to undo that, first of all, I don't think you can. And then second, I'm going to resist that. But if the work is positioned that this is a workplace imperative and this is going to make your job better, and let's talk about this and let's connect that to that, I think that's a different equation. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I do think it's a different equation.
And in the business place, the language matters. The language
Yes.
matters, the purpose matters, the psychology matters, all of that. So
Yeah.
as we're wrapping up, one of the things that I generally do is we talk about resilience, reimagined, reinvented, everything. We're in a whole other we're in a whole other shit show. And and I don't know what's coming in the rest of 2026, and nobody does. So, is there a path? Is there a path for which I would like to see Black women and white women being able to come together and have those very second level conversations about your lived experience, my lived experience, and where that can meet for mutual benefit
Mhm.
without being head knowledge. Those
Mhm.
safe places where we can stop code switching. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
and I've had some really interesting discussions, and that code switching is so deeply ingrained,
Mhm.
or masking of perfection so
Mhm. Mhm.
fundamental to it's a survival skill at our mama's
Mhm.
feet. Don't you ever let
Mhm.
them see you
That's right.
try. I don't know. Again, I don't know that there's a way to do that, but if there was, I'd sure be interested in any thoughts you might have.
Yeah, well, this year I think is going to be wild. I
Uh-huh.
mean, we kicked it off with kidnapping admittedly a bad man, Maduro, but kidnapping somebody from a sovereign country and saying we're taking their oil. Not a mention of democracy or self-governance. So that's how we're kicking off 2026. So things are I think it's only gonna get crazier from there. And I think that we are in a situation where we have an administration that is facing potentially a significant loss in the midterms, which means they are going to try to do a lot between now and November. I mean, they're going to try to nail everything they can down. These are big changes, big things that they're going to be doing. And I think that people have to educate themselves about the impact of these things on their lives, their families' lives. A lot of people know things are going on, but they don't know. or they've heard, but they're not sure. And I think just look up things related to women in the workplace, da da da, understand what's really at stake so that when you talk to people, you can be educated about it. And, the midterms are really going to decide if the United States stays a democracy, which some people point out we're not actually a democracy, we're a constitutional republic, but if we're going to stay the image of a democracy or not.
Mhm.
Um, if the midterms don't provide a check and a balance, I think it's game over for 100 years. And I know I sound very pessimistic, but I do. I think it's game over for 100 years. And there's going to be rollbacks that you're not going to be able to get out of in my lifetime anyway. And so that tells you how high the stakes are. So the stakes are so high that it requires us to drop the pretense. It requires us to say, you know what? I don't understand what you mean. Can you tell me more? And I may not be showing up authentically because of these reasons. Can you tell me if you notice that? Or, I was raised never to be direct. And sometimes when I'm around people who are direct, it makes me uncomfortable, not because there's anything wrong with you, but because I just don't know how to function. We need to drop the pretense. We need to have the backstory, illuminative conversations with each other. We need to say, like, hey, in fact, I was saying something to a friend the other day, and I realized I had only said part of the thing. And I think she thought I meant something. I said, no, 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 I don't mean that. I mean, I had dinner with this person and they said this was important to them. And because what I said kind of in isolation sounded like I was judging the person. Like we literally have to be that granular because we need to drop as much pretense as possible to work together to head off a disaster for all of us.
Mhm.
It's not, and we need to stop thinking, oh, that's for the poor. I'm here as an ally to help those poor Black and brown people or help. No, you are in the boat with
It's
the other people. You are not separate from it. You may think you are. There are some benefits you get, but you are in the boat. And this is not another fight you're assisting. This is your fight, right, for survival. So I think it's just like having conversation with people, being transparent, saying what you don't know, and not coming from the perspective of, I'm going to tell you, I'm gonna help you. I'm here to save you, but I'm here because I also think my freedom is at stake, and it's at stake in a different way than yours. I can admit that, but I do think my freedom is at stake, and I want to help in a constructive way, and I want to just be honest. I think we just have to be honest, and we miscommunicate a lot. I do trainings on this with my consulting. 90% of our workplace problems are miscommunication. And those miscommunication is built on cultural, gender, ethnic, racial, language lines. And we don't say all the words. And
yeah.
what I always tell people is when you are in communication with people who are different than you, you cannot assume shorthand. You cannot assume people pick up your cultural cues. White women, like you said, tend to be more, it can come off to Black women as being evasive and disingenuous. But that happens because there's a training not to be direct and not to be, overly confrontational. That can read to me as disingenuous and duplicitous. That's how it reads to me. So until we have a conversation, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't talk to you directly because it's super uncomfortable for me. And my intention was not to undermine you. And until I say, hey, I was more direct and I wasn't trying to be threatening to you. I'm just, like until we literally brush away assumptions and start really having direct conversations, it's going to be hard to work together.
Sherry, where can people find you if they want to support, if they want to follow, if they
Yeah,
say, where do I get connected? What
yeah,
do you?
yeah, yeah. I am all over the internet. It's Shari, Shari. A lot of people get that confused. Shari Dunn. So if you Google Shari Dunn, you're going to find me on LinkedIn, my website, Substack. You could just any of those, and my book. If you just put in SHARIDUNN, not E, you will find me everywhere. So I have a website, thesharidunn.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Substack at Shari Dunn. I'm on both of those at Shari Dunn. So it's I use my name, so it's a brand name, so you can find me easily.
Occasional podcasts, and you're doing live stream on Substack.
I do. I do. Yeah, I do live streams, I do videos, I do just whatever I can. I tell people I'm very mindful of how hard other people worked for me. And
Mhm.
I think this is something that, again, white women would do well to teach each other how hard other people work for you. There are women who worked hard for women to have self-determination, the ability to have their own money, the ability to have control of their bodies. And we have let some of that slide all the way back. And as a Black person, I've been always really aware that people fought and died for my rights. And so, if I can do a little bit, it's not too much, because it's a little bit considering how much effort went into, getting me here. So,
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and your insight. And I hope this goes wonderful places for everybody. I'll certainly stay in touch with you throughout the year and and see what might come of it.
yes. Well, thank you.
Thank you.